I can just add one thing. Margaret was also the DFL candidate for governor.
Yes.
Should have been governor.
Well, thank you. So first of all, thank you all for coming out. I mean, our weather's cooperating tonight, so that helps everyone get out. But also, I think what an act of resistance to come to an independent bookstore and buy some books tonight. You buy Marlene's book, maybe a few other books tonight, that's an act of resistance, don't you think?
Absolutely.
Okay, good. So we decided that I'm gonna lead off by asking Marlene a couple of things. I might ask you to read a couple passages, which, do you want to tell everyone that?
I've never done that before.
So I figured it might be good practice to do. Let me start by observing, this is such a beautiful book. It's, you're gonna hear us talk about this, but it is the story of your rise into politics from growing up in rural Minnesota. You're becoming immersed in St. Paul politics and then becoming lieutenant governor. The really amazing changes to the lieutenant governor role with you in it. Not only being the first woman, but really being a lieutenant governor with real responsibility, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But then it goes into this other part of the book, which is the very personal part of the book about your and Peter's life together. And for me, it was very moving, the deep love that you two shared together. I'm most certain that still exists.
Yes.
So let's talk about that upbringing. I loved that you were a 4-H'er. I was a 4-H'er. We bonded over that long ago. But the other thing I think is your pluck as a young person. You want to tell the story about when you learned about Macalester College as a high schooler, and then what happened at home?
I found out that Macalester at that time, seems very weird now, but at that time Macalester required a foreign language, 2 years of high school foreign language to apply. And Braham did not have any foreign language courses. And I was a sophomore, so my parents said, well, why don't you go talk to the school board and ask them to put in a foreign language. So I did. So we I don't remember the details of how we made a strategy, and I made a presentation to the school board. And one of my best friend's parents, he was the Chevrolet dealer in town, more conservative than my family. They were appalled that our parents would encourage us to petition the school board for something. I mean, this just was not appropriate child behavior. But as it turned out, there was one of the coaches on the faculty at Braham had been he had a minor in Spanish in college. So he thought this was a great opportunity to get a different teaching assignment than he'd had before. So he went running to the school board and said, if you do this, I'll be the teacher, so you won't have to pay another salary. And it all worked out, and so wasn't probably the highest quality Spanish course known to humankind, but it worked, and it got me into Macalester.
And what a great story of you being able to advocate, and your parents really, encouraging it. They didn't say, "Oh, we'll go fix it for you."
No, they just said, but it was their. I mean, it was their idea. I don't think I would have thought of it probably, but they said, "Why don't you go talk to them?" And that was the amount of encouragement they gave, and so we did it.
So let's touch on the Macalester years and your what I think was really where your parents did encourage discussion of public affairs and what was going on at home, but I sense that you knew you were maybe different than a lot of people in your hometown. You were.
Well, yes, our father was the founder of the first electric co-op in Minnesota. So we grew up talking politics, but And we were clearly Democrats. I mean, I grew up in my brother is here, so he can verify that this actually happened. At Christmas Day at our grandmother's, we had one uncle, our mother's older brother, who used to regularly scream at my father for being a communist pinko. So, I mean, it was every year, it was just like clockwork. And our dad never got upset, he just kind of smiled and endured it, you know, he didn't get excited about it at all. I was more excited about it than he was. And so, in our town, it was a very conservative town, and everybody knew we were more liberal than many people. But my father, our dad had to get along with political leaders on both sides of the aisle. So we just grew up hearing from everyone from John Blotnick and Orville Freeman as the governor to I just lost his name, the Republican congressman from Minneapolis at the time. What was his name?
Judd.
Walter Judd, thank you. And so, I mean, those people were just in the conversation with our dad. So, and we were never allowed to put partisan signs on our front lawn or on our cars, because my father was not prepared, I mean, he felt that was inappropriate for a person in his position. So I think my mother's first sign went up for Barack Obama and the local legislative candidate, Tim Nelson. And she was very proud of that, but that was, 40 years after my father died. So, yeah, and so it was just a political environment, and we talked politics at home a lot. And going to McAllister was part of a continuation of interest in politics, because as I share in the book, Fritz Mondale was the person who first brought McAllister to my attention, and, was talking about Ted Metow, who was a favorite professor of many people, including Harriet Lansing eventually. He turned out not to be my favorite person because he intimidated the heck out of me. She had more gumption to deal with him than I did. But it was a great place, and people like Chuck Green were also on the political science faculty, and, they were very special people to me, and we made lots of friends over the years.
But you were not only a student, you became
No, I wasn't a very good student.
You
but-
became an activist. I
Yes.
can relate to that. During college at Gustavus, when I went to my parents and said I've been approached to be hired by a campaign by this thing called the United Democratic Fund, which was in 1988, and when that happened, they were very worried. They thought it meant I was going to drop out of school and live in my car for the rest of my life. So, and
Could've
you
happened.
had sort of similar experiences with how involved you got as a
Exactly.
college student.
Exactly. I mean, in the year that Sandy Keith was running against Carl Rovag for governor, I organized students at MAC. It was before students could participate where they went to college, and I wasn't old enough to vote, but I could organize people to go to the precinct caucuses, and there were a few students who could participate, they were old enough, and we could organize other people, non-students, to go too. And what we hadn't appreciated, which I share in the book, is that our precinct was Doug Kelm's precinct, and Doug was very close to Governor Rovag. And so he was not at all pleased that his precinct went for Sandy Keith. And so there was a little court fight that students did not have the legal right to participate where they went to college. And that was my first experience raising political money. We sold a little button for a quarter or something to pay for the paperwork that the court required. We had
Your legal defense fund.
Exactly. Exactly. John Morgan and others were pro bono attorneys for us, but we had to pay for the documents that the court required, so. Anyway, that was
I loved reading about that. I also found it interesting, and I think it's important for you to talk about this with people. Most people think that people in politics are raging extroverts, right? And I would stand accused of that, I think, in my life. But that wasn't your experience, and how it made you feel, I think, and the lessons that you came away with
Yeah.
from being an introvert and being in very public life.
I think most people, including my siblings, do not believe I'm an introvert. But I feel that I'm an introvert, and I feel that I've learned, I had to be intentional and learn how to relate to the world. And when I became a candidate, it was the most raw, because I went from being a private person overnight to being a public person. And even in the neighborhood, you know, going to the supermarket all of a sudden became a public event. And you know, and everybody, I mean, I'd always done it, so it, you know, shouldn't have been different, but all of a sudden it was, because people I didn't know were talking to me, and there were comments, and it just was a big adjustment. And I think, one of the things that I share in the book was, after Peter was in my life, the first time we went to an event together, I wasn't having a good time, and he came home and he said, okay, from now on, before we leave to go to these events, if I'm going with you, or even if I'm not, if you're going by yourself, before you leave, you should remind yourself that this is not a social function. You're not going to a personal party. You are going to work. This is work. So just decide which things you have to do, and check them off as you're there and doing them, and when you're done doing them, then depart. And give me an assignment, and tell me what, we'll decide what part I'm supposed to play, and I'll do those parts too, and when we both finished our list of things we have to do, we'll send it off to each other across the waves of the party and the event, and we can go home.
It's such brilliant advice.
It was.
And it was life-changing for you.
It was.
In terms of how you then interacted in all those places. Well, let's talk about the nature of the firsts here. You founded your own company. It was woman-owned, woman-led. It included Linda Berglund in it, which I love, former state senator Linda Berglund. That's an early part of your story. But then, you know, being the first woman lieutenant governor, and the fact the governor believed, Rudy Perpich really thought, we need to change this. His own experience made, I think, really informed that. He did not feel that he was utilized, and there is a story around the Capitol that goes around about how when Rudy Perpich was lieutenant governor, the Governor Wendell Anderson, they just sort of said, they gave him the keys to his office, and they said, you know, go off and do whatever you want to do. Well, he took advantage of that. He traveled around the state. He made his own job up. And what I think is remarkable is in those, certainly in the first term and the beginning of the second term, how much you were really given to shape and hone. And I think people would love to hear about those responsibilities, because some of the things that we have all benefited from were really Marlene's portfolio.
Right. I think the first thing that's important to understand about Rudy is that so much of how he framed his view of the lieutenant governor's role came from his own experience. The first part was is that he and Wendy, the governor, did not have one private meeting, not one private conversation in the whole time they served together. He was never in a meeting with the governor. They never had a private meeting one-on-one. I mean, they just literally, as Margaret said, they just didn't speak to each other at all. They were from two different wings of the Democratic Party, and the Wendell Anderson wing did not appreciate the Perpich crowd from the Iron Range at all. So that was part of it. And then, during the time that Rudy was lieutenant governor, he went to national lieutenant governors meetings, and he met a couple of other lieutenant governors who really had portfolios and were doing some interesting things. So he thought, well, what a waste to not have, somebody's getting a salary, the public is supporting them, they should do some work. So when he decided to run, first of all, he partly picked me because I was female, because he decided that year, if you will recall, both political parties had rejected having women on the ticket. The Republicans, there were people in the Republican Party who wanted Nancy Bradis, Senator Nancy Bradis, to be the lieutenant governor candidate, and the party rejected her. And then Warren Spanis rejected Joan Grow. Now, nobody could argue that either one of those women were more than well qualified for that position. They would have been great, they would have been an asset to either ticket. And so Rudy felt that when they both rejected it, and there was public pay attention to those rejections, that gave him a competitive advantage in the primary. I think if Warren Spanis had chosen Joan Grow, Rudy would not have run for governor. I think it's quite simple. So he felt that the advantage of having a woman on the ticket was critical. And Joan would not do it because she was a party person. And of the other people under consideration, I was really the only person who had a statewide presence and understood, and I wasn't a party person, so I lucked out.
Can I just read this quote to page 52? In the first weeks of the campaign, I learned the basics of campaigning by traveling the state by car with the governor driving. I mean, I think that's remarkable. That was your training. Incredible.
It was pretty special running around the countryside with him, because he was not the world's best driver. He had so much going on in his head, and he was talking about it all the time. And I tell one story about picking, when we came back from up north, he stopped and picked up a hitchhiker. And I'm thinking, oh my God, who is this person? And he's a cute young man, and he's sitting in the back of the car, and all of a sudden he looks through the mirror and he says, Rudy? Is that you? Yes, that's me. And he said, oh, I'm so sorry you lost 4 years ago. I'm sorry, we were just pissed off. We were just upset with Wendy, and so you went down too. But I'm voting for, you're gonna win this time. So, that was,
that portfolio included really revamping the open appointments process to make sure that people who are going to get appointed both to the boards and commissions, and by the way, that's always the first advice given to anyone I talk to about getting involved, is get on a board or commission. You can get appointed, you don't have to get elected, it's a great thing to do. You redid that process, and you also consulted on judgeships, which I think leads to a really good story.
right. Rudy had done it in some version of this when he was governor for those 2 years in the 70s. And then Governor Quinn did some version of it, although he didn't have a commission. Pat Jensen, who became a good friend of mine, did the staff work for Quinn's appointments. But Rudy wanted to do something that was more specific and closer to what is in the law now, I think. But at that time, it was just by executive order. He created a commission. It was co-chaired by Sam Grace and me. And there were 6 or 7 other people appointed to the commission. So we recruited people to be candidates. And the commission interviewed everybody who was a candidate. And then voted, as a commission, we chose 3 or 4 people for each position on the ballot to give to the governor. And then I presented that to the governor, and sometimes I sat there and talked to him specifically about those candidates, and sometimes not. He just worked from our notes. But so his goal, and he stated this publicly, was that he wanted to integrate by gender and race every board and commission he made appointments to. And we accomplished that in 8 years. So, the Board of Medical Examiners had never had an African-American or non-white person on the board. I think they had maybe not had any women either. The Board of Accountancy had neither before. And Dr. Ellis from St. Louis Park became the first African-American on the Board of Medical Examiners. And now I think the board is half non-white, I mean, when I looked at the website, I thought, oh my goodness, isn't this great? I mean, I feel very good because it was so radical at the time. I had grown men crying in my office because they were so upset and uncertain about how this could possibly happen. People they didn't know, and I said, well, most of us know people like ourselves, so this won't be a problem for very long. And, I was at an event last night and Paul Anderson was there, former Chief Justice, and he had a story which I remember when he said it, but I had forgotten it or I would have included it in the book. He said he heard Governor Perpich say one time people were complaining about all the young people he was appointing, and he said, well, that won't be a problem for a while, just wait for a while and they get older. And I mean, I know where he said that, but I had totally forgotten.
I think one of the other places, and it just really strikes me that we basically use a lot of the same terminology today, but it didn't exist previously, and that is the work on tourism. And how you used your marketing skills, your experience running the business to really revamp that. And I think, previously tourism was thought of as going to a resort,
Right.
going fishing,
Well,
kind of that's it.
The tourism, the lobbying group for tourism at the time were the hotel and resort operators. That was it, that's all. And so the first thing I did during the transition was call a meeting that included those people, but also included the Twins organization and the Vikings and the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra, the Minnesota Orchestra, and the State Parks Director, and the Historical History Center, people about historic sites, and I'm missing somebody. But it was a whole group of people, many of whom didn't know each other, and they sat around that round room in the lower level of the rotunda.
15.
Who are you? Yeah, 15, thank you. Who are you? And it was pretty, but 2 years later, they were all working together because, we had little community, based tourism operations throughout the state. Wherever there were state parks, there were people getting together to understand how they could create organizational structures that would enhance, create outfitting groups and all those kinds of things which didn't exist at the time. And then I started doing the Lieutenant Governor's bike ride to call attention to the Rails to Trails program, and
Sometimes life, there are things that echo later on, and one of the things that I thought is standout to me in the part of your life of being the Lieutenant Governor was also your contact, and we can say Governor Perpich was very much an internationalist as governor, and you embraced that. You had many contacts with both international leaders as well as, at the time, a lot of spouses of leaders as well, and how that then gets reflected, we'll talk about how very directly it gets reflected in a couple minutes, but your work and running the association later on, and how that echo of that, did that occur to you as you were going into that next chapter, that those experiences of meeting with, and some travel abroad, we were talking about your travel to Russia and other places.
well, actually, those experiences from my 8 years in public office were part of the rationale I used for getting the job at NAFSA, because I didn't fit any of the other criteria they were recruiting for. They wanted a PhD, and they wanted somebody with higher ed management, administrative management experience, and I don't know, something that I didn't have. And so, but after the headhunter talked to me for a while, she decided that I would be a good candidate, so she went back to the board of NAFSA and said, okay, you told us you want a change agent, so we have a candidate, but the candidate doesn't meet some of the other criteria you want, so convince me that you're interested in change before I bring this candidate to you. And so they did, and I heard the same story from from the board chair as I did from the headhunter, so I think it's the same story. And they're both still friends of mine. And, yeah, so part of what I shared with them about how I think and my experience had to do with my experiences in public life and the international things I did, but also, you know, I grew up in a family where our half-sisters' closest friends in college were international students, and they came to our home regularly, and the Japanese friend became very close to them, and she cooked for us if we all learned to eat with chopsticks. She wouldn't let us eat her meals with forks. So, you know, as children, we were learning that and having that experience, and then we hosted the third AFS student in Graham was living with us for a year, and he's still an important part of our family. So I had started to have international exposure very early.
Let's touch on the children's agenda, and I thought it was interesting that when this idea was brought to you and you went to the governor with it, I think this is correct, he warned you actually about taking on what would be traditionally seen as a woman's issue.
Right.
And you also had maybe some reservations as not being married, not having children, but the remarkable work that was done during that period of time on the children's agenda.
It's true that I felt initially that I was the wrong person because I didn't know anything. I mean, I had to rely on my sister. She was my personal expert at children. She's an early childhood specialist, and traveling around the state, they would look at me and say, "Oh, you look like Marla's sister." So I was very proud of that, but I thought I'd have to consult her a lot. But I was, over time, convinced that it required leadership at that level, and I could do it, and personally, I felt I needed to have one thing that I was focused on. So I went to the governor and said, I want to do this, but I want to do this with your support so that when I speak, I'm speaking for the administration. And he said, well, I think it's a mistake for you personally, because it will be seen as a woman's issue, and it will reinforce the notion that you can only do women's issues. And I said, well, I appreciate that point of view, but if I take on an environmental issue or something else that Roger Moe or somebody else in my sphere is already doing, I won't be able to have any impact. And this issue I will have no competition for because nobody else gives a whit. So I will be able to demonstrate leadership capacity, and hopefully that will show people that I know how to bring people together and get things done on something in addition to tourism. So he said, you sold me, okay. From then on, when I was at press events or whatever and a question came up about the children's agenda, he just stepped aside and said, she answers.
I love that, and I also loved your skill in recognizing that all these other people owned issues around the Capitol, and that if you tried to own their issue, that wasn't gonna work out so well, and so you took that on. I think that is quite remarkable. I think I want you, because you haven't read, I feel like you need to read this out loud. So
Okay, then.
from mid-75 to kind of in the top of 76, wherever you want to stop. I'll hold the mic. The mics are a little, they kind of do this sound thing when we're...
I could not have imagined a personal life-changing outcome when early in our first term, I agreed to represent the governor in a meeting with a representative of Britt Mogård, governor of Sweden's Kronoberg county. Governor Mogård and Governor Perpich had met earlier and discussed establishing a formal relationship between Kronoberg and Minnesota. Since I would be in Sweden the following month to open the Minnesota Trade Office, this meeting would also help me prepare for that trip. I agreed to take the meeting, and my previous plans were rescheduled. At the meeting, Swedish banker Johnny Anderson presented a letter from Governor Mogård proposing a sister-state relationship between Kronoberg and Minnesota. Anderson and his advisor, Peter Frankel, were on a 10-day business development trip in the U.S. The Minnesota visit was the first stop on their schedule. In our meeting, Peter took the chair farthest from me, as he was accompanying Anderson rather than representing Governor Mogart. He participated minimally in the conversation. The hour-long visit was friendly and casual, covering topics from Swedish culture in Minnesota to opportunities for business between Sweden and Minnesota. I learned that our visitors were staying in Minnesota through the weekend. So I casually inquired whether they liked classical music, and when they said yes, I asked if they would like to attend a St. Paul Chamber Orchestra concert with me on Saturday, to which they also said yes. For years, my friends the Desnicks and I had been Chamber Orchestra season ticket holders. I asked if they would be willing to give up one of their tickets and for one of them to co-host the Swedish guests with me. Karen had already decided she did not want to go to the concert, and her husband Leslie was happy to participate. The following day, the governor's office asked me to co-host with the governor a dinner for the Swedes at the governor's residence on Saturday. The first lady was out of town, but the governor wanted to meet the Swedes and talk further about the sister-state relationship. The trade office team would also attend. Since I had invited the Swedes to the concert, the dinner would need to be an early one, which suited the governor well. At the governor's residence, the governor raised a glass for a welcome toast. With a smile in his eyes, he caught my eye at the opposite end of the table and said to the group, "My goal is to get her married." I don't recall ever being more angry with the governor than at that moment. I was speechless and met his look with a glare, prompting him to comment, "I'm going to pay for that for a long time." He immediately changed the subject and engaged the group in a wide-ranging conversation, and I pushed this moment of perfect humor out of my mind.
I loved reading it. I can imagine your shock at him saying that, and but it also signaled something. I don't know, do you think he felt something at that point even?
Well, I don't think so, because when I called to tell him I was getting married, he completely had it wrong. He thought I was marrying someone else.
Yeah, there were rumors abounding, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
So I think he just, those of you who know Rudy, he just did things like that. I mean, he just loved to hear himself laugh. He loved his own jokes. I mean, it was a very endearing quality until it affected you personally.
Yeah, yes. Well, let's talk about Peter and this amazing partnership that you two built, the transatlantic life, and how unique that was in its time. So, a little bit about how you two figured it out to make it work.
Well, I think it helped that we were both grown-ups. I mean, we were both older and both well-established. He had a business in Sweden, and he had been married before. He had adult children and one grandchild at that point. And I was very well-established in my career. So if we were going to be together, it would have to be on those terms. It just didn't work for us to move. I mean, Peter tried to build business opportunities here in Minnesota without much success, and did a couple things, but it wasn't really, from his point of view, successful. And so either we let this go or we made it work. And the thought of letting it go just seemed much worse than the challenge of making it work. And I think over time, we both felt quite enriched by the experience, because we really lived in two places. And as I share in the book, our life here, I was in charge of organizing, and our life there, he was in charge of organizing. And we were very intentional, much more than many people are, I think, about making sure that we met each other's friends. And, you know, we entertained in both places, and we, you know, we were just intentional about that, because if we weren't, it couldn't possibly happen. There wasn't time for any of it to happen without intention. So, I think I learned the value of intention in ways that I had not understood before, and it still serves me really, really well.
I think that, there's several themes in the book, and one of those themes is, your deep friendships with people and how those carried you through, as well as the kindness of people. At times when maybe you even thought that's odd that that person is doing that way, but how that kindness would touch you, and how important that becomes in the last, you know, really 15 years of this period of your life. So let's talk about 2010. We both had kind of very optimistic beginnings of 2010. Marlene actually hosted an event for me out in Washington, D.C. when I was running for governor, and you know, you write that you had hoped that you maybe could become governor, but it really was a foreign thought to people, and I hate to say it, but it still is a foreign thought to people. It just is. I mean, we watched what happened nationally. We still have not had a woman governor, and you really make this change with what happens. But our late 2010, both within 2 days of each other, we both found ourselves in very different situations. Yours far worse than mine. I mean, you know.
I don't compare.
But you know, I lost this election, very close election. We talked a little bit about, you mentioned your good friend Pauline Boss in the book, who has written this fabulous book about ambiguous loss. We always said after losing the governor's race, there's no funeral for a race. People just move on. They move on. They don't. You're just expected to move on.
And they quit answering your phone calls.
Yes. We both share that we think, you know, it's very hard being a woman in politics and then making a change to other careers. But the accident that Peter had, and I find it so remarkable, the depth of your reflection on your own learning in this period. I mean, you describe, you know, first hope for his recovery, and then being his advocate, and then realizing that things weren't going to really improve, and your own reflection on how you cared for him, but also had to care for your own psychology. You were working this whole time.
Right.
You didn't stop working. You can take that wherever you want to go in this conversation, but I think it's important for people to hear, because there really are two books here. There's a book about that political life and public life, and then there's a very personal part of this book that I think there's a lot to learn from.
Yeah. I think one of the reasons that how to put this? I think the reflection to some extent is aided in my own life because I have been a journal writer for a very long time. I started keeping a journal probably in 1970, I'm not quite sure, but I think maybe even 69. Those journals now exist at the Historical Society, but you can't look at them for a while. But
I did wonder about that.
yes, they finally convinced me to give my private journals to them, but I had working journals too that I kept during the 8 years. But at any rate, I had been keeping a journal at the beginning because I really was having a personal crisis that I don't describe in the book, but I was just wondering whether I was going crazy or whether it was, you know, I just needed to understand it. I learned later from a therapist that that's a really sane way of dealing with the personal crisis, is to write about it, because then you can go back and compare notes from day to day. So it was a good thing I did it, but I didn't know what I was doing, but it helped. And I kept doing it, and for years, I spent the first hour of every day writing. And then when Peter's accident happened, well, so I was keeping a journal during my public years also, and I kept a working journal too. So when I went to all these meetings with the governor, which I write about, I was invited to participate in any meeting I wanted to with the governor. So I always had a notebook with me, a working notebook. So there were times when my notes were the only notes being taken for a meeting with the governor, because he didn't like having staff there bugging him. And Rachel will know this. So that often Terry Montgomery or Lynn Olson would call me after the meeting and say, what did he agree to? So, anyway, so when Peter's accident happened in August of 2010, within the second hour I was in the hospital, he was in a coma. I went to the little shop in the hospital and got a notebook so I could start writing. So I kept a journal of that experience the entire almost 10 years. And after he died, well, I mean, there were so many phases, he was doing better, and then he wasn't doing better, then he was doing better, then he went to rehab, and rehab was a disaster, and that, it just, there was, and so, and I was busy advocating all the time, and I was in a system that I was not comfortable with. It was the first time in Sweden that I'd been without Peter as my culture guide. And I was really aware of it. I mean, I had spent so much time in Sweden by that time, but I had never slept in the apartment by myself. I mean, I slept in the apartment here by myself all the time, but in Sweden, I never did. And I mean, all of a sudden, it was, that's so bizarre. And there are places that I didn't even remember how to get to, even though I'd been there dozens of times because Peter had been driving. So, I just wasn't paying attention. It was just ridiculous. So those kinds of things were happening. And so I had to learn the system, I had to learn the place in a new way, and then I had to start thinking about what the system needed to know about Peter if they were gonna help him, because he wasn't able to speak. And at the beginning, he seemed to be very aware and know a lot, but he couldn't express it. So, it was just, so I developed a little 2-page paper describing who he was as a person, so that everybody who worked with him was required reading. If you work with Peter, you gotta read this, so you know who you're talking to. And I think that as I did that, I started I couldn't afford to fail. I couldn't screw up because there wasn't time to recover. I had this mantra during those 9 years: as long as Peter is living, I cannot get sick and I cannot die. I got work to do here, otherwise, it doesn't matter, but as long as he's around, I just have to keep it together. I did not have a cold. I did not have a cold that entire 10 years. Not a cold. I never got sick.
And it wasn't like you weren't exposed to a lot of things, because you were transatlantic traveling,
Exactly.
you were remote working,
I just did not get a cold. Anyway. So, yeah.
It's just, I think, for those of you who haven't read the book yet, but you will read the book, it's such a beautiful part of the book. It's wrenching, but it's beautiful. I will say it resonated with me in 2018 when I ran for office again, the last time I'll ever run. My husband had a stroke the day after the election, and I said, there is nothing that makes you forget about losing an election than when your loved one is in a condition that you're not sure which side you're coming out of on. And luckily David recovered very well, but I really appreciated the depth that you wrote about those experiences and your feelings, and you're navigating the culture and navigating the Swedish healthcare system, which should be a whole another hour, everyone. But I feel like we should let these nice people in on the conversation, so here we go. Who wants to, yes, John, call.
Well, I think this, I don't know if this came my way from our conversations, or I think it was in your book, but I thought, I've known you for more than 50 years. I know that you were very loyal to Rudy Burke. But in the end, I think that last meeting you had with him, there's something you should share with me.
Yeah, do you wanna read that part? If you wait a minute, I'll get it
I
for
can
you.
just-
Okay, all right, you're gonna tell it.
Well, anyone who was here knows that the last 2 years were tough. It was tough for Minnesota, it wasn't just tough for me. It was a very hard time in the administration. There wasn't a cabinet member that wasn't in pain, there wasn't a staff person who wasn't in pain. The governor was in pain, and it affected all of us. And it affected me in my own ways of, just because I had things to do. And after we lost the election, which everyone but Rudy understood we were going to do,
This is 1990,
yes,
and Wellstone's on the rise, and there's the unsettling of the Republican ticket, which I think Rudy thought was going to benefit him,
Yes.
and it did not.
right. Because the candidate withdrew, and then Arnie Carlson became the candidate. So, at any rate, after we lost the election, Rudy sort of, he wasn't around, and I did most of the public things, the holiday Christmas party for the employees, state employees. I mean, they didn't have a chance to say goodbye, and people felt, we had such strong support from the public sector workers in every department, because we had so much fun. I mean, those were the glory years in all of the Midwest. We were doing great things everywhere, and everybody was having a good time, and they loved the work, and they were treated well. The governor loved them, and we had really good, high-performing cabinet members, and they were a diverse crowd, and, lots of fun, and young, it was good, all of it, most of it was good. And so it was a hard time. And I had no conversation with the governor until one day I was asked to come to breakfast the next day at the residence. It was just the two of us. And into the meal, he said, "Why are you disloyal to me? Why have you been disloyal to me?" And I said, "I haven't been. I don't understand what you're talking about." And he said, "I'm told that you have not been, defending me." And I said, "Well, you need to get a new source of information. Because as far as I'm concerned, I'm the only person in the administration who has never leaked anything, ever. And because I have never leaked anything, the Capitol Reporters crowd does not take me seriously. They think I don't know anything because I don't leak anything." And the fact is, I've been to every damn budget meeting, and, I know everything, but I'm not talking about it because it's not my job to talk about it. And so, from my standpoint, I'm the most loyal person you have. And and then I said, "I am so grateful for the opportunity of working with you. I've enjoyed this job a lot. And up until the last few months, I feel like it's been not only a good fun, but we've done a really good job, and I feel good about how I've contributed to the administration. And I will always give you credit for having given me this opportunity."
But that was the last time you ever spoke,
That was the last time I spoke.
which is just a powerful thing, I think, that is heartbreaking.
Okay.
Lori?
Thank you for this book. Thank you for sharing so much of your story, both personally and professionally. When we talked about 6 months ago, it was an optimistic time for Democrats, and it was a time when it was fun to point out the many similarities between your set of firsts in the 1980s, and the set of firsts that Kamala Harris represented. And we were all speaking optimistically about what a great preparation, being a number two in an executive role, how that prepared one well for executive leadership. And of course, the candidate you were rooting for and the candidate we were describing that night did not win that election. And I would now welcome your reflections on how voters in Minnesota, voters in the United States, how voters understand and feel about female leadership in light of what has just transpired.
I don't believe that Kamala Harris lost because she was alone. I don't think there was a candidate who would have won. I think the issue is much bigger than that, and that I do think that our party has done a pretty lousy job for a while now at communicating and really owning the issues that should be at the core of who we are. We have really neglected working people. We've gotten very enamored with wealth ourselves, and and so I think Kamala Harris was well prepared, and I think that I used to, in Washington, one of the things Peter hated about Washington was that dinner parties were so tedious because Democrats, which is who we went to dinner parties with, would sit around and complain about whoever the Democrat was. And he said, "What's the matter with you people? You elect these people and then you just chew them up and spit them out like they're not," he was just ridiculous. He would just get so upset, he'd talk all the way home. We'd be walking home from Georgetown, and he'd just, "What's the matter with you people?" And so I think people in my crowd of friends would complain that Kamala Harris was not getting enough visibility. And I would say to them, I don't think her job is to make you feel good about getting enough visibility. Her job is to be prepared to be president. She could be president tomorrow, and she's gotta be prepared. She doesn't have to be doing precedents to make you happy. And so I think, that's a part that we really haven't appreciated enough, and I think that even though it probably wasn't a perfect situation, these are never perfect situations, but I think that basically she was prepared. And she is certainly better prepared for that job than the person holding it right now. In terms of qualification, there was no comparison. And so.
All right. How would you like to end this? Because I think these nice people want to buy
Well.
books. What would you like to say?
Well, I'll say that, I've had a really terrific life, and I have, writing this book was something that I really enjoyed, and after spending most of my life believing I could not write, enjoying writing the book has just been one of the treats of life. And now that I've written it, I'm having just as much fun out here promoting it. So that I find just amazing too, because everyone else, all the authors I know, first of all, they all say writing is just a slog. And it never was a slog for me. I don't understand why, but I had a good time. Once in a while I'd get tired and take a nap, but I just enjoyed it a lot. And now I'm having a good time, partly because I get to see all these people I haven't seen before. The other part of it is that many times the questions raise an issue in a way that I haven't thought about before. So I'm thinking about things in new ways, which is really fun. So I would just like to say thank you, Margaret, and thank you all of you for being here. It's just
an honor to be asked to do this. I have to say, I was a little knee-knocked when I think you or John first sent the message. I really am honored to do this with you. My earliest political memories are your political life, and so that is really a great thing. Tell everyone about the cover, because that's the other thing. I love the cover.
Me
What
too.
color is this?
I love, this is Skåne red. Skåne is the southern part of Sweden.
Oh.
It's, I wanted to choose the designer for the book, and the publisher, University of Minnesota Press, said, no, we use our book designers. But you give us all this I wanted to because I was in the business and I knew a lot about designers, that's why, and I knew one of our designers is designing books, and I was secretly wanting to ask her. At any rate, so I gave them this feedback that I don't want my picture on the cover, I want to have a graphic that somehow relates, I don't know what I mean by that, and I want this red. I took something out of my shelf and showed them the red I wanted, and, yeah, this was the first design they showed me, and I loved it, so,
Well, thank you for the
Thank
gift
you.
of the book and the gift of you.
thank